And we've shown that humans are pretty important in this story. So this, I think, is an origin story for the 21st century. It's the story that's my son, that's my grandson Daniel, the cool one with the dark glasses is Evie Rose Molly, and they will have their hands on the levers of power in 20 or 30 years' time. And I think this is the sort of knowledge that they will need if they are to land this huge machine that I described. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor David Christians. So now we will have the Q&A sections. So if you have any questions or thoughts, feel free to raise up your hand and we will pass the mic to you.
Alexis, if I can't understand the questions, would you be able to? Okay, thanks. Could I just explain that my hearing is not very good, so you'll have to speak very clearly. But I'm dying to hear your questions, so I'm very keen to hear them. Okay, thanks a lot.
Professor David Christian, I have attended a big history conference in the HKAGE this July. I want to ask a question about big history. It's because in the modern society, the high school students may learn about big history, but they're just doing the computer project, get a master, and then go to university and become something like a hedge fund manager and just go about their own lives without and forget about the whole big history thing. So how is big history going to concretely change people's lives so they don't just forget about it like every other school subject?
Right.
You were saying that, okay, just like students, they take a course like that, and then they will go on and maybe go to university, become an IF banker, and then how can you make sure that they can take this, internalize it, and have an impact?
Thank you for your question. It's a very good question. And I'm afraid the answer is I can't make sure at all. That's up to you. What I think is important is, at the moment, this very wide-angle way of looking at our world is not taught. It's taught in very few places in the world. So at the moment, there's no chance at all that people will understand this story. So let's begin somewhere, like in your school, and slowly teach it, and hope that some of the students who learn this story will have that story at the back of their minds, and it will slowly affect how they think of many things, even if they become investment bankers, God help us all. Yeah, that's the best answer I can give. Thanks for the question. Yeah.
Hi, I just here. Hello. Yes. Okay. So you mentioned your big history project being part of the Enlightenment of sorts. So would you liken yourself to members of to intellectuals from the Romanticism period, such as Samuel Taylor Coleridge and all these other thinkers? And also, just a small other follow-up, how would I apply big history to a discipline such as anthropology and history in my studies?
Okay.
And
Yes.
He was saying how to apply big history into individual disciplines.
Right. I'm not sure it's a matter of applying big history to individual disciplines. Let's go back to an earlier world, say the world of Isaac Newton. So Isaac Newton, one of the greatest scientists of all time, he came up with some of the foundational ideas of modern science. But if you think about it, he did so within an origin story. Now, his origin story was Christian, and that was an origin story that told about a universe created by a god. The modern origin story is rather different. It's a universe that just is. But all his thinking, including his scientific thinking, took place within that framework. So I think what this can do is help us see that good knowledge really consists of two forms. There's the very detailed knowledge. I'm not against specialization at all. The specialist disciplines have been a very effective tool for learning about a massive amount of stuff in area after area after area. What I'm arguing is that we need specialization, but we also need the ability to stand back and see the links between disciplines. And I think if you think about literature, I think you mentioned some of the great 19th century. Now, they are actually thinking about our place in the universe. But if you think about it just within literature, your thinking's going to be limited. Today, we actually know a lot about how our universe was created. Coleridge didn't know that. Now, I hope you'll agree that if you think poetically about the universe, this is important knowledge. So I think an origin story can sit at the back of your mind, but it can sort of steer your thinking, and it can help you get out of the silos of modern education. There was something else I wanted to say, but I've gone blank on it, so I have to, yeah.
You mentioned that entropy actually dissolves any sort of energy or things, or like they eat them up. But why don't entropy eat up the Big Bang and stops it from expanding?
Yeah. Actually, it's also part of a response to your question. The idea of entropy in physics is very powerful indeed. It does a lot of sort of heavy lifting in physics, in biochemistry, and in other areas. And physicists understand this idea very well. And it generates very deep questions about the nature of the universe we live in. If you want a comparison with, say, the Christian origin story, entropy is a bit like the devil. Entropy is what destroys good things. So for physicists and cosmologists, the sort of questions you ask are absolutely fundamental. So I asked it in the very simple form of saying, if entropy is so powerful, and most physicists would say entropy is very powerful indeed, this is one of the most fundamental laws we know of, how is complexity possible? Well, a friend of mine who's an astrophysicist, when I said entropy is the bad guy, said, no, you're completely wrong, David. Which is why I said, or maybe the hero of the story. Because what this guy said is, entropy guarantees that there will be flows of energy. Now, that energy may be degrading, but it guarantees there will be flows of energy. Those flows of energy allow the creation of complex things. So it may be entropy itself that allows complexity. But I didn't talk about the future. In a big history course, of course, we end at the end of the universe. And we actually can say something about the end of the universe. It'll be, don't worry about it, it'll be so far in the future, gazillions of gazillions. The universe has existed 13.8 billion years. Multiply that by several trillion. And you've got the dates we're thinking about. But at that stage, entropy will finally break down everything. Everything will break down. Planets will break down. You and I won't exist. And entropy will win. So eventually, entropy will certainly win. But in the meantime, entropy allows complex things to happen. That's a sort of partial answer to your question, and I can't give you a more detailed answer because the question itself is so deep that I think most cosmologists and physicists wouldn't be able to give a complete answer to it. But thanks for the question. Yeah.
Professor Christian, you talked about just now how you kind of mentioned the end of the universe. Since you said in your talk that the universe is constantly expanding, and I think there are several theories on how the universe will end, do you think that the universe will eventually be so complex that it will continue gradually becoming more and more complex, or do you think that at some stage there will be a point in which the universe will eventually degrade into its original simple form?
Yeah, again, that's a great question. And it's the sort of question that cosmologists and physicists wrestle with all of the time. And I'm a historian, so now you may think that someone who tells the history of the universe lacks all modesty. Well, I actually have a bit of modesty, and I know I'm not a cosmologist, so I've tried to read what the cosmologists say. The universe is not only expanding, the evidence now is that the universe is expanding faster and faster and faster. So I think one way of thinking about it is that you need energy flows to make complex things. But as the universe spreads out faster and faster and faster, those flows of energy get thinner and thinner and thinner. So sometime in the future, it'll get harder and harder and harder to make complex things. So that's why I think most cosmologists think that the universe is going to be expanding faster and faster and faster, and it's eventually going to get emptier and emptier and emptier. But there are theories that imply that there might be some sort of rebound and that the universe will actually contract again, and that this is called bouncing universes theories. You know, it'll contract to something very small, there'll be another big bang, and then it'll expand again. But at the moment, I think the betting is it'll just keep expanding forever. Yeah. But it's, as I say, these are the sort of questions that cosmologists spend all their life trying to think about. And at the moment, we don't have that much evidence, apart from knowing the rate of expansion of the universe and having some idea about how much stuff is inside the universe. Yeah.
Hi, so I just wanted to know if there's like any way to be able to specialize in the big history course, because yeah, it just crosses so many different disciplines, and if you want to know it in depth, then is that a possibility, or?
So, is there any possibility to specialize in big history?
Look, no, again, it's a great question. I suppose in a sense I've sort of done that, but it's a bit paradoxical really, isn't it? So one of the things I was trying to say is that the knowledge world of the 20th century is actually a bit strange, and most of us don't notice this. It's a knowledge world in which we assume that good knowledge is specialist knowledge. And it's a world in which we don't really create a place for those people who try to link all the disciplines. There isn't much of a place for them. Now, if you're going to be a specialist big historian, that's probably your specialization. And in a sense, yes, there are special skills involved in trying to do that. They are a bit like the skills of translators, because can you translate the jargon of a physicist, say a word like entropy, into the jargon of a historian? Edward Gibbon wrote The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. Should he have said the rise and entropy of the Roman Empire? If historians use the word entropy, would that change what we understand by entropy? Would it change how physicists think? So there's a lot that big history thinking has to offer, and specialists in big history will be people who try to mediate between the language, the concepts, the paradigms of many different disciplines. Now that's one level of answering your question. A second is a more pragmatic one. I hate to say this, but there are no positions in universities in big history. So, you know, as a graduate student, I really hate to say, I wish it wasn't true. I wish you could go to universities and say, I want to specialize in big history. But one reason why that may not be so bad is that my personal belief is that this is a sort of story we all need to know. We need to have it in our background. And then, with that in the background of your mind, specialize in something else. That's what Isaac Newton did. So I'm not sure we actually need lots of courses in big history. What we do need, I think, is that lots of people have some familiarity with the story, and that might encourage some of them to pick up some of these transdisciplinary research projects about the use of energy, use of information, another great example. Physicists talk about information, computer scientists talk about it, specialists in communications, historians talk about it. Are they talking about the same thing? Is it the same concept? Can we clarify what we mean by information by talking across disciplines? So yes, in a weird way, there is a sort of specialization. It doesn't yet take the form of academic departments. I belong to the Department of Modern History at Macquarie University. There are no graduate positions, I fear. But I think it's possible that understanding big history can drive some great research projects within the existing, more specialized research structure. And environmental science, by the way, is a wonderful example of a field that is being driven very powerfully towards interdisciplinary research because it has to, given the nature of the questions it asks. Yeah, thanks for the question.
Thank you. There's this notion that humans are like very important and have a special place in the universe, but actually, like humans are made of carbon-based molecules, and carbon is a pretty, like statistically, there's a lot of carbon in the universe. And what if, like many other intelligent beings, maybe? So I don't think that statistically, the chance of intelligent beings being involved are really that small, and are humans really that special, or are we actually exaggerating our own importance?
Sorry.
Okay, so he say humans are carbon-based. That's not really that much. There may be possibility of other type of like silicon-based.
Yeah.
Are we over-exaggerating our importance?
Yeah. Okay. I said that this story can show the importance of humans. And so let me admit that that's probably slightly exaggerated. If you think of the whole universe, in time and space, we're incredibly recent and we're incredibly small. But on the scale of this planet, it looks as if we are creating a turning point in the history of planet Earth. So that makes us very important on this scale, and maybe important in this part of the galaxy, because we don't know of any exoplanets near us at which something like this is happening. So that's pretty important on a galactic scale. Now, go back to the other issue. I read a wonderful article just 2 days ago about the distribution of chemical elements in intergalactic space. And you may know that there's a sort of small group of elements. Now, there are scientists here who you'd know better than I do. CHNOPS, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, and you could probably add one or two, that are pretty common inside galaxies. Now, if you take a human body and you put it through a blender and you analyze the elements that come out the other side, you're going to find CHNOPS. In the universe as a whole, hydrogen and helium are still dominant. So the appearance of our sort of species depends on creating very special environments in which these sort of chemicals are common. Now, how do you do that? Well, the answer seems to be, I talked about Goldilocks environments. When our solar system formed, there was a thing called the solar wind, a burst of energy from the young sun. Now, most of the elements in the solar system were hydrogen and helium, a tiny sprinkling of all these other elements. That solar energy from the sun drove away most of the hydrogen and helium, leaving an environment dominated by all the other elements. Can you see how Goldilocks conditions are created? So that meant that our young Earth was a beautiful environment for creating complex chemistry, really complex chemistry. And it looks as if the carbon chemistry worked better in this environment than silicon chemistry. Silicon's quite similar to carbon, but not identical. Now, what that means is we're finding millions and millions of exoplanets. So what that means is there are probably maybe 1 billion planets, a bit like Earth, in our galaxy. that suggests this sort of chemical mix, these Goldilocks conditions, are pretty common in the universe as a whole, so that life is probably fairly common. But you remember that time chart? It took 3 billion years to get from single-celled bacteria to multi-celled organisms on Earth. Now that seems to be telling us that creating multi-celled organisms is extraordinarily complex. And that suggests that the chances of hearing from other organisms that we could communicate with are very, very rare indeed. And as you may know, we've been listening for 50 years through the SETI project, and so far we haven't heard anything. That's probably the best answer I can give to that one. And I think, by the way, that most astrobiologists would argue that silicon-based life is going to be much tougher to build than carbon-based life. So if we find life, it'll probably be carbon-based.
Thank you, Professor Christian. You talk about in big history, you look at different disciplines, cross disciplines. But one discipline I did not hear you mention, politics. Especially when human beings were created, 200,000 years ago. So I guess maybe you have politics before that, but definitely after that. And the importance of politics is these politicians, they make decisions. When later we talk about climate change, sustainable development, Donald Trump and others, they make decisions. So why did you ignore that very important discipline, please? Can you tell our next, maybe some of them are going to be our future politicians, so they need to know. Please.
Okay.
Do you need another translation?
Okay, so I'm clearly in trouble. Let me try and get out of trouble. The first way of getting out of trouble is to say the list of disciplines I should have mentioned but didn't is colossal. And it goes way beyond politics, by the way. But of course, the story's saturated with politics. God, what's a quick way of trying to describe this? One of the things you can do in big history that's very hard to do in most university courses is try to get a sense of human history over 200,000 years. Is there a larger trajectory? And I've argued there is, and it's got a lot to do with collective learning. Now, that process is a process of sharing, it's a process of negotiating as well. Because collective learning includes not just information about how to catch kangaroo, or when edible plants come into season. It also includes rules like rules about good behavior. What does a woman do if she has twins in a dry environment? Should she let one of them die? Sounds really harsh to us, but these sort of rules. So there's a huge amount of politics, but we know that for 200,000 years, human politics consisted of negotiations within groups that we would think of as families. So that's the foundation. In my view, to study politics without understanding that foundation of negotiation is to miss something very profound. Then after agriculture, we start getting larger communities, and then the nature of these negotiations is transformed. Suddenly you have communities of, say, 1,000 people, rather than communities of maybe just 20 or 30 or 40. Suddenly you need new rules for politics. So you can see how politics itself becomes more complex as aristocracies emerge, as you get some people who are regarded as powerful just because of who their parents were, not because of what they did. So you get aristocracies, and then you get all the political systems of the great empires from 5,000 years ago. And then in the modern world, of course, this staggeringly complex global world, we have new levels of politics that involve negotiations, relations across the globe, which is completely new and is something that appeared in the last 500 years. So I actually have a friend. He's the current president of the International Big History Association. He teaches political science at Villanova University, and he's, I think, writing a book called Big History and Politics. And of course, he will go back in time, and he'll talk about chimp politics, and he'll talk about bacterial politics. Do bacteria negotiate in some sense? Do ants negotiate? Because these are all the multiple levels at which you can think about politics. And so my argument is that there may be insights into the nature of politics that can be seen at all these levels. What are the difficulties in political negotiation of particular types of groups? We face many of those difficulties today. And one final comment is, I think there's a strong argument for saying that our physical technologies, I was mentioning this before, are developing very, very fast indeed. Think of the internet. Our social technologies and our political technologies are lagging behind. We need new types of institutions, we need new types of politics, because a lot of the politics at the moment seems to be really struggling. And I say that as someone who lives in Australia. Where I've watched a series of assassinations of prime ministers. That's the best I can do for a short answer. Yeah.
We have time for the very last question.
Thank you, Professor David Christian. My question is it possible to get one unified origin story, or like combining all fields of knowledge into one entity, considering that like there are knowledge which are culturally dependent, like say indigenous knowledge, religions, etc. And how can we incorporate those into our kind of modern story? And also there are people who do not believe in science, people who reject climate change, for example. We see that very common. Like how is it possible to have a modern origin story that everybody universally agrees to?
I suspect the quick answer to that is no. But the question you raise is very important. And one of the reasons I've started talking about big history as an origin story is precisely because it allows us to ask this sort of question. It allows us to ask, what sort of origin story is this? How does it compare with other origin stories? Now, there are certain things you can say about this story. First, it's the first global origin story, the first story that was constructed by contributions from around the world. It's also the first origin story that is accepted by many people all around the world. All earlier origin stories were locally based in particular cultures, particular religions. Secondly, this origin story sums up so much information that it's incredibly powerful. Now, power's not always good, but it gives us the power to build nuclear weapons, to build planes, to build this complex society. So it's a very powerful origin story. There's a sense in which, if you live today, this is probably an origin story you need to know pretty well. That's slightly different from saying you need to believe every aspect of it. It'll be told in many different forms. If you lived in Australia 500 years ago, it wouldn't be the story you'd need to know. You'd need to know an indigenous Dreamtime story. If someone dropped a physics textbook in Australia 500 years ago, I often ask the question, what would be the most useful thing you could do with it? And the answer is light a fire, because it would be completely useless. But if you live in today's world with 7 billion people, we surely need the knowledge of a modern origin story, because without that knowledge, we won't be able to feed them. And a final point, you make a very good point about indigenous origin stories. Talking about origin stories allows us to compare them, and one of the conclusions I've argued in the book is that this story is very powerful. It's a story we need to know today, but it has some severe limitations. And the one I think is probably most important is that this origin story emerged at an era of human history that was incredibly dynamic and manipulative. That's it, within the last 1,000 years, okay? And that means it's inherited a sort of manipulative attitude to the biosphere. Now, if we're to build a more sustainable world, there are things we're going to have to learn from origin stories, particularly indigenous origin stories, which imagined a much more stable relationship with the biosphere. And they saw themselves as living with the biosphere, whereas we tend to see ourselves as living from the biosphere as using the biosphere. So this story certainly has its limitations, and I think there are very important things we're going to have to learn from indigenous origin stories, which is why in my book I imagine telling a story around Lake Mungo in Australia 40,000 years ago, because in its way that would have been the story you needed to know then. So I don't know if it's a very deep question you asked. That's the beginnings of an answer to it, but it's a way of saying I don't at all think of this origin story as perfect or one that everyone needs to believe in every detail, and it's also a story that's rapidly evolving. It's changing. Yeah, so thanks for the question, a very, very good and important one.
That's the end of the Q&A section. Thank you, Professor Christian. We will now have our first break section, and please come back by 3 p.m. for the student conference. The washroom and the water refill station is next to the lift, and you can see it after pushing the other door. Also, if you don't get to ask any questions due to the limited Q&A section time, please feel free to mingle with Professor Christian and other students around. Thank you.
Went very well. Okay, and also I hope you enjoy the